Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Philosophical Friday. These are your co-hosts, Peter Birmingham, and yours truly, Duncan Palamordes. Peter, how are you today, and who do we have again in the podcast today?
I am very well. Thank you very much, Duncan. And this week, we welcome back our first returning guest, Duncan. It's great. Our first returning guest, the ever-popular Mr. Andrew Brokos, who just this week had a little bit of good fortune, shall we say. Is that right? You're very welcome, Andrew, by the way.
Thank you. Am I really the first returning guest? Have you guys not been doing this long, or are you just really good at getting guests?
We've only on our 50th episode, give or take. So yeah, we're doing it.
I will say, Thinking Poker was going back to the well by the time we got to 50.
Really? Okay. So that's good to know. That's good to know. But I mean, you're very popular, and people, we're very happy, and they definitely wanted you back, and we have some questions and things like that. But like Peter said, something very interesting happened to you this week, right? Why don't you tell us more about it? What happened with tournament-wise?
Yeah, I ended up getting second place in a tournament that America's Card Room was calling the main event of this poker series that they've been running. Although, poker sites and the WSOP has started doing this as well. You get more players if you call a thing a main event. So the series is still going for another week. I think there's another main event this weekend. I don't know what it may, but it was a large field. It was a multiple day one, 1,600-ish people, and ended up taking second in that, which is someone said congratulations, but surely no. I mean, I won't say that I've never experienced the congratulations thing, but that was not this. Like I was, I think maybe in sixth place coming into the final table. I really did not deserve to do better than third. It was a huge, maybe not a huge punt, but there was a person who was very solidly second place in chips, and I truly was giggling with laughter when he managed to get himself eliminated in fourth place. I was giddy. It was such a bout of good fortune for me that by the time we got to heads up, I was I was out chipped 13-1, so it wasn't like I came in with an expectation of that I had much chance of getting first, but even second felt like I was already batting well above my weight. Punching above my weight? That's the metaphor I'm looking for.
Is there a small insinuation in there, Andrew, that there may have been some ICM mistakes at the final table, or?
I suspect, I don't want to call anyone out, and it's not the very strongest part of my game, but I will just say that I certainly made a lot of I think it's quite possible that I made more money as a result of that shove than the person who called in one made.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes, and you mentioned one word there which I've never heard before, but I can totally relate to. How did you say it? Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Okay, yes, which reminds me, on an MTT of 1,600 people, 1,599 are going to be disappointed, and one is going to be right.
Yeah, and I do. I mean, again, I certainly know the feeling of that, and there is, especially when you come in, because again, this was coming into day two. I think I only had an average number of chips with still 150 people left. So you tell me the beginning of day two that I'm going to make the final two tables. That's already a well above average response. I think I have had the experience. Sometimes when I've been deep in the WSOP main event, where I said the first time I experienced this, I ended up in 2008. I think I was 35th in the WSOP main event. So coming into day 7, I was second in chips, and I ended up finishing 35th. So that was kind of, I had made a bunch of money on days 1 through 6, and that felt great. I did lose money on day 7. Right. So, there is kind of the feeling of yes, obviously the tournament went very well for me. I won a lot of money. I do not look back on it with regret or anything like that, but it is true that I probably lost $100,000 that day. And I did feel that.
Yeah, and many years later, and in general, for people who play tournaments, what is your approach to that feeling? Because a lot of people can relate to that. I mean, they play for a long time, they cash in, and it always that lingering feeling of failure. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I can say what makes sense for me. I know that there are people who are, they really just they want to win, and they're just extremely competitive and driven, and it doesn't strike me as a super like happy existence. Like you're not going to be happy often if you're playing an MTT and you're only happy when you win, especially if you're playing large field tournaments. Now, those people might win a little bit more consistently than I do. Like it may be that drive and the desire to avoid the pain of losing, pushes them towards a level of greatness that I'm like not quite going to achieve because I don't have that same drive. And I mean, I don't know that I would want the trade-off if I could, of saying like, oh, I wish that I experienced that. Like, I wish that my life were like mostly constant misery, so that I could like occasionally, win tournaments more often than I do, or something like that. I don't know that that's a trade-off I would want, but it's also just not the way that I'm wired.
Absolutely. No, that makes perfect sense. And I remember when I was in your podcast and we were discussing tournaments a lot, and a lot of ideas came up, and one of them was, is it worth it from many perspectives? The idea that we're risking very little but we can win a lot, but then there's also the idea of EV. It could be a low EV from a cash game and all of these things. But do you think tournaments in 2023 are still worth it, and what should people think about and consider in order to decide whether it's good for them, and if that question is not too broad?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of considerations there. I guess one big one is, there's certainly more variance in tournaments, and that's not always a bad thing. As you pointed out, like I think some people, they might not fully grasp that this is what they're doing, but that premise of, well, I want to be able to put up $500 and have a shot at winning $1 million, like that's you saying that you enjoy variance, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but like that's what you're getting there. That's a lot of variance, and so like that has an upside for people from the perspective of a professional. And like, as much as we just had that previous conversation, like I do enjoy winning more than I enjoy losing. And it is, the nice thing about cash games is you do win a lot more consistently than you do in tournaments. You much more often leave the casino with more money than you arrived with, or log out with more money than you logged in with, or whatever. So what I often say is like, if I could get the same people who are going to play in a tournament with me for X stakes to instead sit at a cash game with me, and we're all going to be 100 big blinds deep, and we're going to play for the exact same amount of money, I would love to take that deal. Like I would happily. I find cash more interesting in any way. The more I've studied tournaments, like I'm starting to appreciate some, like there are some, additional strategic depths to even like very short stacked tournament play that I didn't used to appreciate. So I am having a slight more appreciation for it, but nonetheless, like I do think overall, like deep stacked cash is a more interesting game, and the edge is potentially larger, the variance is lower, like all those things are nice. For all those same reasons, like that's why people don't want to play cash games, for the same, like people who are less good at poker than I am, they want the variance. They like, and there's like a lot of things about tournaments that make them appealing for people. So I think there are reasons why for an equivalent amount of money invested, you can expect to have a better hourly rate playing tournaments, but that does come along with a lot more variance. And like my co-host Carlos, he likes to focus on playing small field tournaments, which, I mean, that's kind of a nice middle ground of, you do make a lot more final tables, and you get a lot more wins when there's 100 people in the field instead of 1,500 or something. So I think that's a nice consideration. I do also think there's like, tournaments are in some ways less stressful. I mean, that kind of sounds weird, because in some sense a tournament is just like a misery machine where you just sort of keep cranking up the stakes until eventually you lose. Like, because people like to complain about, well, I was running good for, like, I always run bad in the most important spots. It's like, yeah, of course you do, because that's how you get eliminated. Like, you continue to run good, and then like eventually you run bad, and the run bad is the end of the tournament, so it's always the highest stakes. But where was I starting to go with that?
No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And it reminds me that, if you do like a back of the envelope calculation, you can do like a very simple logarithmic analysis. And then you basically see that depending on the size of the field, you sort of like gauge how many flips you got to win, roughly speaking, right? I mean, 2 to the 10 is about 1,000. So for every 1,000 people, you need to win about, 10 coin flips, give or take. I mean, of course, you're going to have some edge. It might be 9 or something like that, but you still need to win. And exactly what you just described, like at the peak of your performance, if you will. I mean, at some point you have to win those flips or something close to it. Speaking of which, what are some highlights from your session? Like going back and remembering, because you said it was multiple days.
Yeah, it was 2 days.
It was 2 days. And what are some interesting things that happened that come to memory? Funny, interesting, strategic, anything you want to share, like exciting moments, anything at all?
Well, I think part of it is it's kind of anti-exciting.
Okay.
And this is part of like I think what requires to play poker professionally or to want to make money playing poker, which regardless of whether it's literally your profession, if you want to make money, you do need to treat it like a profession. You know, you are not going to get the same thrill or enjoyment from the game that a recreational player is. I think we talked about this the last time that I was here. So you know, a lot of I was making a lot of really tight folds, essentially, as with like 2 tables remaining, and especially at the final table with the chips being distributed the way they were. Essentially, with 6 of us remaining, there was one person who had like 60 big blinds, another guy who had 40 big blinds, and then there were 4 of us who all had between 10 and 15 big blinds.
Right.
So with the chips distributed like that, essentially, my main objective is get 3rd place. Like that's kind of what I'm gunning for. And I think there are some people who are uncomfortable saying things like that out loud, that it somehow feels like an admission of like, no, you have to play for the win. That's like more manly or whatever. Like I guarantee you what makes you the most money is playing for 3rd in that situation.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
So like I was really focused on like doubling up is not worth that much to me. Even if I double up, I'm still in 3rd place. I was already in 3rd place, not by a lot. It was very close between the 4 of us, but it was like there is like the impetus is really on other people to even if everyone is playing perfectly, even if everyone perfectly understands all the ICM dynamics that I'm explaining right now, it's still correct for me to be pretty conservative. And 1 or 2 things is going to happen, right? Either those people who are shorter stacked than I am are going to get eliminated, and that's I make money immediately when that happens, or they're going to double up. And if they do, then I become the more short stack. And now it does become correct for me to take more risks. But the impetus really ought to be on the people with the shortest stacks. So there were a number of times where it was like, you know, I have a pretty good hand. I have, I know, like ace-5 suited on the button. And it's like, that's a pretty safe shove. Probably no one's going to call me. Even if they do call me, I'm not going to be in terrible shape. But there's just not that much gain for me of like picking up 2 big blinds in that scenario compared to like how bad it is for me if I get called and I get eliminated or lose most of my chips and double up a short stack or something like that. So, you know, it didn't strike me as being worth the kind of risk reward of doing that. So it's sort of, it's boring and it feels bad, you know, like if you're like, I would like to be getting more chips, and I know I probably would have more chips if I just shoved with this hand. And so there's that kind of discipline that's required to not do that. Like that's kind of the work, because otherwise I'm just like sitting in front of my computer in my pajamas, you know. So like it's not work in many senses of the term, but it is work in that sense of needing to do things that are kind of like painful or unpleasant or whatever. And so it was nice to like, I mean, to get rewarded for that, to see that so you know, those folds become even better once you do have, like, if your opponents are going to take unnecessary risks. So what ended up happening, the way this person who was, you know, very solidly in 2nd place got himself eliminated in 4th, he raised, and it was like a pretty good spot for him. He was raising into the 2 short stacks. So, you know, there's like a decent chance he's going to take the blinds down. And then the player who had more chips than he did 3-bet him, which we might expect because he does have more chips. Like he can 3-bet very aggressively. That's true. Like there's a very good chance that this person is just like 3-betting him light. And then the guy who was in 2nd place went all in with Queen Jack suited, and he got called by Ace King offsuit. And even there, he's not in terrible shape. Like it's, I don't know, 43, 57 or something like that. Like It's pretty close to a flip. But he didn't win the flip, and he ended up getting 4th place when he could have very easily folded his way to 2nd. So, you know, I'm not saying that doesn't strike, even if you're going to have some bluff shoves there, which maybe, you know, you are supposed to. I don't think that's the best hand for it. I think you'd rather have an ace in your hand when you make that play. But I mean, that was certainly the most fun moment for me of the tournament, was a pot that I wasn't even involved in. And just like, you're just watching it happen and you're like, oh my God, I never thought, you know, like it's probably worth like $30,000 to me just to see that outcome. And, you know, to have that happen without, there was no, like, I wasn't even involved in the pot, you know, and that's like the essence of tournaments, is that you make money by folding. And usually it's not that dramatic, but that's really the thing that makes tournaments different from cash games. And it's always true, even from hand 1 of the tournament, it's true that like folding has an EV that is slightly greater than 0. It's just that there are certain situations where that EV is much greater than 0. And so it's not enough to say, oh, shoving would be plus EV here, because you have to compare it to the EV of folding, which, you know, in this case was quite high.
this is incredibly interesting, and you're mentioning so many points here. I really do not know where to start. I mean, you're mentioning the idea of presumably what you're doing being boring. You're mentioning the idea of the huge ICM considerations, how the short stacks are really the ones at risk, and conversely, the big stack can actually have can take advantage of that. But also, if they don't know how to take advantage of that, they can end up shooting themselves in the foot. You're talking about the idea that folding doesn't necessarily have zero EV like in a cash game, because you have to compare to opportunity cost that is very real in tournaments. The idea that potentially, you know, there are situations where because of ICM considerations, you need to make a lot of tight folds. I mean, these are incredible points for the listener. One question I have for you is, when you use the word boring, perhaps for, you know, for an outside observer, but did you yourself feel bored, or how was your internal experience when you were in control of that situation? How did Andrew feel when he was able to make these tight folds and see them come to fruition? What is your internal feeling at that point?
Well, the seeing them come to fruition part was, you know, that was like giddy excitement when that happened. The thing is, you don't always see that. Like sometimes you do what I'm doing and you end up in sixth place, you know, like a couple of those short stacks get lucky, and then it becomes correct for you to take a risk. And then you wonder, like, oh, maybe that wouldn't have happened if I had shoved that hand. I mean, if I'd shoved that ace-5 suited on the button, maybe all this would have been different. So, you know, I kind of got the good end of the fortune stick this time around, and so that, you know, that's not painful. One of the things that also was fun about the like final table experience was I did have my friend and co-host Carlos was sweating me while I was playing, and you know, I want to be clear, this was all happening after the hand was over. You know, I would tell him, like, you know, these are the hands that I focus. Frankly, he knows a little bit more about ICM sort of stuff than I do, so it helped a lot to navigate those doubts, because I mean, I didn't know this stuff cold. Like, I was kind of, I understand the basic principles of GTO, but I have not spent hundreds of hours grinding, or sorry, ICM, but I haven't spent hundreds of hours grinding like ICMizer or something where I like know exactly what is the shoving range on the button in this scenario. So I did have the nagging doubt of like, oh, maybe I was supposed to shove there. I don't know. Like, I guess this is a fold. You know, I was kind of trying to reason it in real time. So to get the validation from him of saying like, oh yeah, that's a good fold, I like that, you know, kind of encouraging you to continue to, or just making it easier to continue to do that difficult thing, to have someone who's validating and have someone you can brag about to it, because, you know, we can brag about like the big wins, I, you know, rake this big pot or whatever, but like, you know, like I think we were saying this some last time as well, you know, the big folds are at least as important as, you know, making a hero call or something like that, but they don't feel as good because chips aren't getting pushed to you. And so you know, being able to brag about that and give yourself a little dopamine hit for making a good fold, that's a big help.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that you're mentioning the big folds, because I always feel, and I don't know if it's the same for you or other poker players, or you, Peter, the idea that when you can actually make a big fold, there's something about feeling in control. It's like, oh, I control that hand, you know, like I was able to do it, you know, and it's to me, that's I don't know if I would call it a dopamine rush, because it's a different type of feeling, but it feels like a huge win. It feels like, oh, I'm in the zone. I can actually make that fold. I don't know. Do you have like a similar feeling, or is it different? Is it different for you?
I do. And I think that's what you want to be trying to cultivate, is that idea that your satisfaction is coming from playing well, or it's maybe, I mean, this is not something that I personally do, but it reminds me of things, you know, people who they wake up early and go jogging, you know, and they say they wake up, it's still dark outside, and they go run at 5 a.m. and they run 4 miles or whatever. And it's like, I think a lot of them would say they don't enjoy it exactly, you know, it's like they don't love the alarm going off at 5 a.m. and going out in the cold and running and all that, but like they feel good about having done it. And I think some of that is that same sort of control or self-discipline or whatever that you're talking about. So I think you do want to cultivate that pride in like, I did a hard thing that I know is good for me and is correct.
Beautiful. And anything else interesting that happened there? Anything funny? Anybody like chatting, or maybe people?
There's no chat on ACR anymore. You just get emojis now, or you get little animations.
Oh,
I can launch a rocket ship at my opponents, or I can blow like a party horn if I win a big pot or something. I can throw a tomato, but no, I can't call anyone racist slurs anymore in the chat box.
I've seen actually the rockets. I mean, I was playing there recently, and I've seen that, but I didn't know there was no chat. I mean, I never chat with anybody, so I thought that the people didn't. I didn't know that they deactivated. That's actually good to know.
Oh, I'll tell you, this is a funny. I mean, I don't know if this came up in that tournament exactly, but it's a funny thing that happens on ACR. One of the animations that they've added is if there's a bad beat, if somebody sucks out on someone, there's like an explosion and like the screen shakes and stuff.
Yeah.
But the way that they define a suck out is just anytime someone goes from being a favorite to being not a favorite.
Right.
So sometimes there'll be a time where like a blank comes on the turn, but like a big draw was like technically the favorite on the flop because they had like 52% equity or something.
Right,
so like a total nothing card comes on the turn, and ACR is like, holy shit, and like the screen shakes, and like it's.
I remember that they were doing that. It's like, what happened? It's like, oh yeah, it's just totally bricked.
Yeah, six of diamonds, crazy.
That's 6 of diamonds. How about any deal considerations? Like, were there any deal considerations, or they're completely out of the table to begin with?
It never really came up. There's an option on ACR. I don't know what they would do since there's not chat, but you can click a thing that says like, I'm interested in a deal. So one person at the table had that clicked. I guess if we all clicked it, it would time out, and they would like show us some. Or maybe we just have to take an ICM, or they would show us ICM numbers, and then my guess, since there's no chat, is they would just show you numbers, and you would just click yes or no, but there wouldn't be a room to negotiate or whatever. But no, so I think in that scenario, it would not make much sense for the big stacks to take a deal. And this is just a limitation of the ICM model in general, is that it's not forward looking. It's not taking into account that person who has all the chip, the guy with the 60 big blinds or whatever, that person should be able to use that large stack to continue to accumulate chips. So ICM just like takes a snapshot of, if we divided the prize pool now based on the proportion of chips that you have, here's what you would win. So it undervalues big stacks. And this is a scenario where the big stack was particularly valuable. So I did not click to make a deal, even though I would have been open to it, because no one else had it clicked except that one person. And there was very good reason why the big stacks would not be looking to. There was also one person at the table who I was just saying it was like correct to be tight, but this person was like, had been too tight for a long time. And like clearly was just, a more amateurish player than some of the people at the final table. So I wanted to outlast at least that person before I, even considered making a deal, because I was like, I still think I have a pretty big edge over at least one person here.
That's actually
and that is an important. Sorry, Duncan. I was just going to say, and that's obviously a very important factor, Andrew. Like when you look at the sort of the caliber sometimes of your opponent, if you have any sort of like, I mean, obviously if you're at like a super high roller or something like that, where sort of everyone is a known player and you realize there's probably not going to be too many ICM mistakes, but if you have a sense that there are some recreational players or less experienced players at the final table, that's going to weigh into a decision there to, these guys are probably going to make more mistakes than I will in this situation. You'll be giving up money at that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, listen, congratulations again. I mean, you make the poker community proud. I'm sure a lot of people were cheering for you. I mean, I was very happy when I saw that on Twitter. So, congratulations again. And just how does it, like, overall, how does it feel, like second place on such a big tournament?
It's good. I mean, I've been doing this for long enough that it's not like, I'm still more affected by the short term. Like, it surprises me still how much I'm affected by the short term, but it's not, I don't know. I mean, nothing has really changed in my day-to-day life as a result of it or anything. I'm still going to be playing like all the same stuff that I always want. Like the constraint for me for a long time has been skill more so than bankroll. That's like limiting what I play, or like is the reason why I'm not playing certain higher stakes games.
Sure.
So yeah, and I mean it is a nice confidence boost, especially when you're playing these like really high stake or large field tournaments, which is pretty much all I'm playing these days is these like big field tournaments on ACR, it's like you don't get those victories very often. And I know intuitively that it's like not really supposed to happen that often, but it does still. It's been like 2 years really since I've had like a big win, so it does. It's nice to have that reminder of like it is possible to win these things. Like it is a thing that happens from time to time.
Yeah,
absolutely.
You're in the mix anyway. You're in the mix for that result at some point.
Yeah. And you do have to believe that, because I mean, and this is something I tell, like when I'm coaching people, I think this is true for cash games as well. It's really dangerous to go in believing that you're going to run bad or believing that you're in a slump or something like that. Like downswings absolutely exist in the rearview mirror. Like you can look back and say, I've had bad results recently and I think I've been playing well. It's just, I've been getting unlucky. Like that's a thing that you can empirically recognize, but that of course has no bearing on the next hand that you're going to play. And if you start to believe that it does, you're not going to take the appropriate risks. You're going to say like, oh, I don't want to take a flip here, even though it would be like totally correct for you to take a flip because you're getting odds to call or whatever, or it might not even be a flip in the first place. You just like, there's a tendency, I think, to fixate on worst case scenarios or to assume that things are just never going to work out for you. And then that becomes a self-reinforcing spiral where like, because you're not taking the risks that you should be taking, you're not bluffing in spots where you should be bluffing or calling when you should be calling or whatever. And then like you actually are going to have worse results because you're not playing well.
Absolutely. And actually, it's funny that you mentioned that because Peter and I, we had an episode where we were talking about superstition, and essentially we're talking about this self-fulfilling aspect of it. And even though, superstitions, for many reasons, we can say that the items to which they're attached, they may not be real. The acts themselves are very much real and they could affect outcomes. And by that, I mean, even though, like a black cat may not really be unlucky, if you really think that that black cat is unlucky, it could affect the way you think about it. It could affect the way you deal with things. So sometimes wearing your lucky shirt can actually help your mind get off of that thing and not think about it. And that can actually help you make the right decisions. We call them like the low cost sort of like superstitions, like the ones that they could be potentially low cost, but it's would you agree with that sometimes things can become like self-fulfilling prophecies in some sense?
Yeah, I mean, I will say I don't really have a thing like that. Like I know, I guess Michael Phelps famously, kind of has a whole routine that he goes through before he swims, and a lot of that is kind of, as I've had it explained to me anyway, is kind of the experience of like a lot of things going well, and kind of your I guess your body or your mind, or there's no distinction between the two, whatever. But you have. There's an association between I go through all these steps and I listen to this music and I take my shirt off at this time and whatever all he has to do, and then that's very strongly associated with success, and because like the culmination of that is and then I win the race. And so like everything about his kind of being is expecting that that's going to happen, and it is entirely plausible to me, or I certainly don't think I know more about it than the people who are saying that this is true, that like the that affects your physiology and your psychology and whatever else. Maybe that means I should have some things like that. I don't really, I don't have a lucky shirt or whatever, but I don't like roll my eyes at people who do, as long as they're not imposing costs on other people. So I do think that the like, asking the dealer for a for a wash because people feel like they've been getting dealt bad cards or whatever, like that's kind of annoying, because then that is like, there's like, if you want to wear your lucky shirt, fine, as long as it doesn't stink. But like, again, like don't put the cost on other people, as long as it's like a thing that you're not asking other people to pay for, then it seems fine.
Absolutely. It has to be low cost. And I would agree with that too. And you also mentioned short term, right? I mean, you mentioned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that, sometimes you're affected even to this day by short term, which it's actually very interesting, because I think it's part of a more general idea, which Peter, Brad, and I we're calling it the proximity principle, if you will. That tendency that we have as human beings to basically concentrate on something, on the temporally and spatially close. Like, the thing that happened more recently is more important than the thing that happened 10 years ago, even if the thing that happened 10 years ago could be more impactful. And the reason why I'm saying this is, are you familiar with Peter Singer's child in the pond argument by any chance?
I am, yes.
You are, right? So Would you mind telling us this argument? And then I'm going to ask you a question for the listener. I also have a little bit of an excerpt. I could also read it for the listener, or if you want to describe it for the listener, whichever one you feel more comfortable.
Yeah, I guess we'll let me do my best, and then you can,
Please.
if I get anything wrong, you can you can correct me. So my understanding of it is sort of, I think this actually kind of connects another thing that we talked about last time, which is I was saying that our sort of moral reasoning around people who are very close to us is better than our moral reasoning for people who are like distant from us, and I guess that maybe applies to time in addition to space. But
Right.
you know, basically anyone. Imagine you're wearing like a really nice suit or something, expensive clothing, several $100s, and you pass a lake, and I don't even think you would have to stipulate that it's a child. Like there's a person who is drowning, whom you could rescue by jumping into the water, but in doing so, you will ruin your clothes. Like it's about as close as we have to universal agreement of a moral principle is like, if I mean obviously there might be some danger to you, like there might be other reasons not to do this, but if it really were the case, it's just like, oh, you're just going to ruin your $1,000 suit but you can save this person's life, like most people are going to, I mean, A, expect that other people would do that, and B, do that themselves, I think. So then the question is like, well, we all have that opportunity all the time, right? And in fact, we could do a lot more than save. Like I have $1,000 right now that I could spare. Like I could use that to help a lot more than one person, and sometimes I do that, but like I don't do that to the full extent that I possibly could, and most people don't. So I think Singer's argument is sort of like, well, if you conceptualize it that way, maybe you should maybe you should be giving away more money than you would, because you essentially could be jumping in lakes and saving people all the time at a cost of much less than $1,000.
That's exactly right, and it's very well put. I don't have anything to add to the argument, but I guess there's two questions that arise. And by the way, for the listener, that's how I coined the term proximity principle, from exactly that very example. But before we go there to the proximity principle, I just want to ask you, Andrew, what do you think of the argument? Do you see any problems with it? Do you see any? Do you like it? Do you not like it? What are your thoughts?
I like it.
Mm-hmm.
I find it a useful, like, which I think is kind of what Singer intends for it. I find it a useful motivator. Like there's always a part of me that's like, well, you could also just keep $1,000 and spend it on things you like. And so I'm like I think it's kind of a part of being alive, or at least living in our modern society, of kind of like navigating these things of just like our daily existence, sometimes in ways that we have control over and sometimes in ways that we don't. Like we are kind of constantly causing harm to other people and or foregoing opportunities to help other people. And I mean, I wouldn't claim that I have the perfect balance in my life, but I'm happy to be encouraged to be doing more on the like helping people side of things and the like doing less harm to people side of things. And there is a kind of innate drag against that, which is my own like laziness or comfort or whatever else. And I think a lot of the world is built to encourage me to lean into that. I think much of our world is designed to discourage me from thinking too much about the consequences of some of my like consumption decisions, or the way that I live my life and things along those lines. And so I find it useful to be mindful of those things, to think about who benefits from those things, and to recognize that that's a force that I need to like push back against. That if I just sort of go along with the tide, I'm not going to live the kind of ethical life that I think I should. So like that there's an effort that's required to push back against this just be selfish, only think about yourself kind of reasoning. And I think that being familiar with that argument from Singer, like I think that's a useful reminder of, okay, well, here's what you really believe in. We know that you believe that, because I mean I've never been tested in exactly that way, but like I at least agree in theory that like that is certainly the right thing to do, is rescue the dying child. And so I think that having that as a reminder is useful.
Absolutely, it does work as a great reminder. There is one aspect of it. I guess if we were to imbue some constructive criticism to it, and perhaps I can share like my story, which as it relates to this. I used to think exactly like that, and to the point that I used to wear a little black ring around my finger to remind myself that everything that happens in the world, to a smaller or a greater extent, I have responsibility for, right? Because like the butterfly effect, that somehow I have contributed. If there is a war happening somewhere, somehow I have contributed, because it's like there is this sort of like a domino effect. And I used to like feel that we have to remember every day that we have responsibility to all those things. The constructive criticism, I would say, to that argument is that I would argue that it ignores what I would call the proximity principle, the fact that we are sort of like wired to deal with the things that happen to us, again, both temporally and spatially near us, so that we can avoid overflow. And the reason why I'm mentioning the little story of mine and the little ring that I used to wear for like almost 2 decades, to the point that my skin started to deform after a while, is that basically I was ignoring the proximity principle. I was being sort of like overflown with all of that information, and I was not able to sort of like deal with all of this, if that makes sense, Andrew. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. And the argument, of course, makes perfect sense. We just have to remember that we're better dealt with the things that happen around us versus like in the immediate surrounding versus the extended surrounding, even though, of course, the radius of that extension depends from person to person. Elon Musk radius is not the same as ours, for example, or yours, mine, and so on and so forth. I don't know. What do you think about that?
That seems plausible to me. I would, and this also just constructive, not even criticism from my side, but just to ask you to elaborate. Right. What's the reason you would say for why you're better off dealing with things that are proximate?
I think from an evolutionary standpoint, so that to preserve the energy of if we were consistently thinking of everything, all of the triggers of our environment, both the immediate ones and the extended ones, we would essentially go mad. Like, I mean, we will not be able to process it. So for practical perspective, I would say, like for just evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah. I think that's like an important concern. The I think I don't know, solution is maybe a firm way of putting this, but I think I've encountered some advice along those lines, because I often have that feeling as well of kind of like, I mean, it is literally too much. Like, it's trying to carry the suffering of literal billions of people is more than a person can handle. And right, part of the problem with that is like, if you end up then becoming less effective, or you're just sort of like wallowing in despair or whatever, and not helping anyone, like that's certainly not helpful. But there might be a different way of focusing that energy other than just what's closest to you. And that might be just sort of like picking a particular cause and saying like, I'm going to focus on, what I can do with this one organization, or what I can do with homelessness or something along those lines. And except like, that's not me saying homelessness is like the single most important thing, or that other things aren't problems or anything like that. But it's just like, we're better off if we all just sort of like pick a piece of the rock and start chiseling. Is that a reasonable metaphor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes.
That's better than like, everyone just kind of haphazardly trying to do everything at once.
And to your point, I just want to clarify that I use the term closest metaphorically, which is why I said that, Elon Musk's proximity is not the same as other people. Like, so his proximity is basically, for example, it would encompass the entire world in some sense, because again, he says something on Twitter and everybody hears about, everybody who has a Twitter account, that is, hears about it. So I would agree with that 100%. Like, if you can reach that charity, that's part of your circle, that part of your proximity. But if there's like, let's say, a war happening in a household, or like, let's say there's some domestic abuse somewhere that you don't know about, or I mean, you don't have a direct access to that, maybe you shouldn't necessarily like blame yourself for everything that's going on in the world, because it can get incredibly overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think there is also a problem of, I mean, there are reasons to think that you're going to be more effective at handling situations that you are more familiar with, right? Like the history of, I mean, I would, not all these organizations are well-meaning, but I think even the history of like well-meaning organizations that have decided to like, we're going to fix I mean, even to decide that a certain thing is a problem is already kind of an exercise of presumed authority to say that, like, okay, there's a problem of trying to think of a good example off the top of my head, but just, in sort of a culture that you don't understand, or a part of the world that you don't know that well, or something. I mean, I think that there are a lot of dicey things that happen as a result of like people deciding that they know how to solve this problem in a different part of the world. And I will say, just in terms of like where I've personally directed my efforts, one of the organizations when I do give money charitably, most often to, is called Give Directly, which is they give money directly to people living in poverty. So that's designed to get around this problem of like, I'm not coming in and saying like, oh, the person living on the other side of the world, what you really need is a well, and so I'm going to come in and build that well for you, and I'm going to presume that I know where to build the well and what kind of well to build, and the well is even what you need in the first place, all those things. And essentially, if you give money to people living in poverty, that they are going to know better than you are how to spend that money in order to make their own lives better. And even your idea of what it means to make their life better might not be their idea of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And since you mentioned that, do you wanna tell us more about the charity for anybody who might be interested in? They want to know more about it. Is there like any website, or it's just what should they Google or something like that?
Yeah, just givedirectly.org, I believe is their website, and you can see, they have various numbers on there if you wanted to see like how efficiently the money gets from you to the people. Obviously, all these organizations do have overhead of some kind. I do think in general, like if you are donating money, it very often is, even if you assume that there's like additional overhead that's involved in like getting that money to a different part of the world, the money is still going a lot further. Like I think that's part of why I'm like pushing against the proximity thing. I do think there are people who, and I don't think you're doing this, but I do think a lot of people make mistakes around the idea of proximity, of thinking like, well, I have to look out for the people closest to me first, or people in my own community first, or something like that. And I mean, I think there are some arguments in favor of that, but I do think there is a big issue of like, there are a lot of people whose lives can be improved by, a literal like dollar a day in some parts of the world. And I don't think that's true for very many people in the United States. And I think the particularly dangerous form of the like proximity principle thing is the like, well, I just want what's best for my family. And
Right.
people are kind of having the idea that that's not selfish because it's not for you. It's for your kids, who you see as an extension of your own ego, but whatever, I think like a lot of harm comes from that idea of like, my only obligation is to the people closest to me.
Right, exactly. And that's the literal proximity. And you're absolutely right. I mean, literal proximity can be pathological. You're absolutely right. We're talking about a metaphorical proximity. Of course, it needs to be defined. And there's a lot of nuance. But part of the reason why, I sort of like went into that thread, because you mentioned, the short-term impact and how important it can be. And I feel that the proximity principle, this time it's the temporal proximity principle, has something to do with it, right? I mean, it's very real. We often talk in this podcast about that feeling, like the thing that just happened to us, and how important it is, and how sometimes, we're talking about tilt, sometimes it can throw us off our game. Sometimes how people feel they hit a temporary variance, and they're like, oh my God, I mean, I can't make a hand. And then you go back to your graph and you see that this little variance is like a little blip, it's a nice 45 degrees. And all of a sudden we're complaining about this. But the fact how that even if that's the perspective, it's still very difficult for us to, in the heat of the moment, to deal with it, because the proximity principle in some sense is ever present. It doesn't go away. So we have to sort of like respect it in some sense. It's there. That perspective is not easy for us to do it in the heat of the moment. It's not like we're not grateful for that everything that happened to us. It's just that our brains operate in that way, in some sense. Do you feel that way, or do you feel that this is something that us poker players at some point we need to overcome? We don't need to think about like this.
I mean, it would be great to overcome it, but I don't know how realistic that is. So I think it's better to have ways of dealing with it. And you mentioned one important one just in speaking there, which is, looking back at your graph, and, your long-term results are meaningful, and it is useful to look at, okay, I am, I've been consistently winning for a long time. And so even though the last few weeks or whatever have felt bad, there is a track record of me doing well. Now, certainly in poker, that's not a guarantee of anything. Like, plenty of people who were winning 5 years ago are not winning players now. So, that's not a total panacea, but I do think it's useful to counteract negative messages that to be, dicey, not necessarily wrong, but like not well-founded, that your brain is giving you. And then I also find, like, this is one of the biggest benefits I feel like I've gotten from, like, studying game theory and having more of a sort of mathematical foundation for my game. I know that there are some people who are very, like, intuitive players, for lack of a better word, kind of playing from gut, and many of them, are quite effective. Like, intuition is a real thing, I believe, and it's a potentially a powerful thing. The problem is that it's also, I don't know, sensitive is not quite the word I'm looking for, but I think that your gut, there's situations that you're not going to be as familiar with, where your gut is not going to be such a successful guide. But also, there are times where your gut might not want the same thing that your, like, brain wants, where your gut just, like, really wants to book a win, or just wants to take a pot from that asshole on the other side of the table, or so I think, like, I don't always trust my gut to want the right things. And so I do find it useful to be able to say, like, I'm not doing this because I want to win the pot. Like, of course I want to win the pot, but that's not, that's not like a sound strategic reason to do a thing. So to at least have a gut check, to be able to say, I have some sense. I certainly don't have, like, solver tables memorized, but I have some sense of what I think a solver would probably tell me to do in this spot. And then, is the thing that my gut is telling me, is it perfectly aligned with what the solver wants to do? Okay, great. That's all I need to know. If it's not aligned, then I have to try to imagine, like, okay, well, do I have a good reason for why I want to do something differently? Like, I try to, I guess, intellectualize like, why do I have the feeling that this person is going to fold? What can I actually find a foundation for that? Do I have reason to doubt it? Have I been losing this session? So, one real good piece of advice, I say, one of the best, like, strategy episodes we've done on Thinking Poker in recent years was with, I believe, Ori Peleg is how you pronounce his name. He's an Israeli pro, he works for Upswing, really entertaining guy, very smart game theory wise. And essentially he was like, if you are, I think the example he used was, like, getting check raised on the river holding aces.
Mhm.
And he was like, if it feels close to you or you don't want to fold it, fold it. Like, everyone, nobody wants to fold aces, right?
That's right.
Like,
Right. That's
you're
right.
you're always going to be, like, a little more attached to aces than you should be. So if your gut is telling you, like, oh, this is a close decision, it's probably not actually that close.
That's actually a very good point, and it comes back to the things that you were calling boring earlier, right? I mean, that sometimes you just have to make these uncomfortable decisions. And Peter, you had a very interesting question for Andrew too. The tweet that he put a while back.
I was looking back through your Twitter. I just want to drag you back about it just over a week ago, Andrew, to a tweet you put out. And it says, I hate the insistence that anyone pointing out a problem must have a solution in hand. We should be able to establish goals as a community and work together to better align our practices. People refusing to consider a problem without a solution on the table don't really want to solve it. Now, can I just say that I absolutely love this tweet, because I think it's absolutely brilliant. I wholeheartedly agree with it.
Thank you. Please go on.
Yeah, it did. It just caught my eye, and it was like, absolutely, like, what? And I said this to Duncan earlier. Sometimes you have the skill to point out that there's a problem. You don't necessarily have the skills to fix it, but it's okay to point it out. And I think, I think as a society, we're too quick to kind of jump on people who, say, well, that's a problem, but I don't know how to fix it. And you're called a naysayer, and all this negativity is just thrown your way down. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, and I will say, there was one response I got to that tweet that I thought was like good pushback and encouraged me to think a little bit more deeply about what I really wanted to say there. And I think I would want to make a distinction between kind of pointing out a problem that was already taken into account when a policy was put in place. So like if we say something like, we're going to go to we're going to play 10-handed for a while at the start of this tournament in order to accommodate more people, and then you're kind of go, oh, I hate 10-handed, it's crowded and whatever. It's like, we understand that, like, that's known, and essentially like the decision, like that was weighed when this decision was made. And you're not necessarily, like, if you have a different way of, like, essentially the tournament organizers have decided it's more important to try to accommodate more people, even if it means people being a little uncomfortable at the beginning. So just grumbling and saying like, I'm uncomfortable, this sucks, is not particularly productive. And so I do think it's reasonable in that case to say like, well, I mean, if you have a different suggestion for how to accommodate these people, that's something. But I think there are also cases where, maybe the problem, you think that the people making the decision were not aware of the problem that it was causing. And so, essentially that discussion has not been had. This is not a question that's been asked and answered. So, raising this thing, saying, oh, there's this issue. And I think that you'll agree with me, like, you just weren't aware of this. And once I make you aware of it, ideally, you would agree with me that, oh, that does seem like an important priority. And let's at least think if there's a way to accommodate. There may not be, but, let's at least think if there's a way to accommodate that. And if we can agree on it as a community of like, okay, this is an important thing that we should be trying to fix, maybe there is someone who will have a solution to that, but it has to start with an agreement that there's a problem at all. Or like, I think those should be separate questions. And so I do kind of question the motive sometimes of people who want to sweep that off the table entirely, or there's a particular solution maybe that they don't like, and so they want to deny that the problem is there, because they're like, well, if I acknowledge the problem, then I might have to accept the solution, and so I'd rather just deny that the problem is there. That kind of thing sort of irks me.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Duncan, how much of that do you think self-interest just factors into that, Andrew, when people kind of, maybe it's adding to workload, or it's just going to make things extremely difficult for them? Or how much do you think self-interest weighs into those situations?
Heavily, like almost exclusively. I mean, I think it is like, I think most people, if in the absence of self-interest, I think most people are not like bad thinkers. I think like when there is a clear like logical error that's taking place, I think there's usually a reason why it's happening. I don't think it's necessarily intentional. Like, I think sometimes people are just I don't know, our brains operate in strange ways. Like, I think sometimes our brains are just kind of motivated to not show us certain things, or we just have a lot of resistance or for various reasons around recognizing things. But yeah, I do think that it's I think when I notice things like that, I think there's usually a reason for it.
Right. And it's a very, very good point. And actually the way you're presenting it, again, it reminds me of the conversation we had last week about compatibility, right? Because it sounds like you're looking for that compatibility at the beginning. We can call it compatibility of disagreement, but at the end of the day, it is a compatibility. Like, you said, we have to agree that there is a problem. We have to start from the same common place. And if, the argument is well-meaning, I mean, we all have our self-interest, but we don't put our self-interest above the argument or above the issue, then hopefully we're going to be able to find some sort of a compromise, or going to be able to negotiate, or going to be able to move forward instead of just essentially having a war, basically like the two opposing interests. And that is a very important point for sure. Was there anything from perhaps last week that you wanted to shed some more light on, or something that you thought about and you said, maybe I wanted to say something? Because I know last week we were a little bit short on time, and there were some things that you perhaps maybe wanted to add, if something comes to mind, like as
there was something pretty specific that I remembered. There was a point that I had meant to make, and I distracted myself, as I often do, and kind of went off on a tangent and lost it. But I think it's a good one. It relates to the idea of like exposing yourself to there's kind of the idea of, it's important to expose yourself to like ideas that you disagree with, or something like that. And I qualified that of, I think it's even more important to expose yourself to ideas that you didn't even know existed. Like, it's there are certain things of like I have considered the argument that like African Americans are inferior to white Americans, and I've dismissed it. And I don't feel like I need to keep debating that with myself or with anyone else. Like I feel good on that one. Like I'm that's not a debate we need to keep having. And then so I'm more interested in following a Scots language activist on Twitter, which is an issue that I know very little about. Like I'm going to learn more from that than I am going to learn from following some like right-wing person who's just like asking questions about whether we shouldn't be considering eugenics or something. Like there's certain issues that I don't feel a strong need to like continue reevaluating. But I also think there's, even within that, it's important that the people that you're like exposing yourself to are credible to you, because I do think that like the kind of what I would consider like bad actor voices in the of which there are quite a few in like the media sphere these days. I don't think it's quite right to say that they're like trying to keep you in a bubble or try to keep you from seeing other opinions at all. In fact, I think it's quite common that someone will purport to give you anyway an idea of like, here's what other people believe, and they might even bring on their show, like I think there's a fairly common tactic that they'll be like, they'll have the sort of staple liberal or staple conservative or whatever who they bring on the show, and they're almost there to be a straw man, like even though they are technically a real, like it's not hard. I mean, there's how many billion people on the internet, like you can find one idiot who will say whatever, and like so I think there's a tendency to want to like use that person as a stand-in for like, look at this look at this idiot, this person represents all liberals. And so I think there's a real danger of that, where you do end up just kind of reinforcing your own ideas if you're only exposed, like it's hate reading essentially. It's like, I am exposing myself to stuff I disagree with, but not in a way that's challenging my views. It's in a way that's reinforcing my views. And so I think that's like almost worse than not exposing yourself to it at all. So I think it's like you need to find people who challenge you, and that's not the same thing as disagreeing with you.
That's a very good and well put point there, right? I mean, the idea to find people that actually challenge you, and they're well intended, which is very important, but they don't necessarily have to agree with you. Do you happen to have like any names, like for example, I don't know, like an example on the left, or some may even say far left, who is considered by many to be a credible source, would be somebody like Noam Chomsky, for example. I don't know if you may disagree with that, but like do you have some examples of people both like like on the left, on the center, and on the right, which you would consider like credible, well-intended sources for people to potentially expose themselves to?
Off the top of my head, the main one I can speak to, I think, is a person who I sought out for this purpose, which is Tyler Cowen, who hosts a podcast called Conversations with Tyler. I don't know how many like. I mean, I don't think the far right would want to like claim him as a I'm sure there's a lot that he would say that they wouldn't necessarily agree with, but I mean, I think when it comes to sort of a well-intentioned person who's trying to have good conversations and bring in really a wide variety of perspectives. So he'll on his, so first off, I think he's just a great interviewer in general. He has a very unique interviewing style, and that's one thing. Just as a person who does an interview show myself, I do try to find people who are good at just the skill of interviewing, and I think I benefit to some degree from that. But I think he has a very good and I've heard him and his producer talk about this, a good filter, where it's like anyone that you hear on that show, I mean, I'm sure you could find exceptions if you went back, like he's been doing this for years, but like it's a pretty reliable indicator of like, if there's a person on that show, even if I have no idea who they are, and it's not a field that I'm intrinsically interested in. Like he had an archaeologist on there recently, which like I know very little about. It's not a field, I mean, it's kind of neat, but like part of her point was like, it's not actually all Indiana Jones. Like it's not, like that's the sexy idea of the archaeologist. But like it was a fascinating interview. So I mean, it's exposing to a prince to just a lot of perspectives that I wouldn't have been exposed to, period. But B, he has I would say like at least an economically like pretty conservative worldview, and I guess hearing him, I mean, both some of the people who he brings on who are more right leaning themselves, but also like hearing the conversations that he has where it might be like maybe the guest is the one that I agree more with, but he seems genuinely interested in kind of like hearing their viewpoint and like challenging them, I think, in constructive ways. So hearing the way that they grapple with like the points that he raises or whatever, I don't know, I just find it like one of the more, and again, like this isn't to say that I like, but I mean, the whole point is I'm seeking out people. It's not that I expect to like come away agreeing with him, but just in terms of like better understanding what are the arguments from people where I think that there's a baseline agreement of what's important and there's just a disagreement about how to achieve it. Like that I think is an important distinguisher. Like if you're coming from a place of I don't know, just like the lives of poor people don't matter. Like if that's kind of your baseline philosophy, like I don't see how we're gonna have a constructive conversation. Like I'm not gonna be the one to convince you that they do. So but I mean, I think that there are people in the world who have very different ideas from my own about how do we improve the lot of people living in poverty. And this is one of those cases where like it's okay, so we can agree there's a problem, and I have some ideas about how to fix it. I wouldn't claim that any of them are perfect. And I know that some of them like have been tried and haven't always had great results. And there might be reasons for that and whatever. But like, I want to be open to anyone who is truly genuinely concerned about fixing that problem. Like, I think we need as many ideas on the table as we can, because I think it's an important problem. And the problem is that there's a lot of noise in that space of people who are not actually well intentioned, who purport to be, who are like they're claiming that that's what they're concerned about, but they're actually just propagandists. And it's very hard to distinguish between those. And again, I wouldn't claim that anyone does it perfectly, but in terms of seeking out a more like right leaning voice, that's the person that I feel like I've benefited most from, and have the most respect for their like the thing that they're putting out in the world.
Absolutely. And you said the name is Tyler Cowen. Did I?
Yes, Cowen.
Cowen, just for the listener, if they want to go and check them out. I admit I haven't listened to them, but it sounds
Conversations with Tyler is the name of the podcast.
Conversations with Tyler. Excellent. Well, again, I mean, Andrew, I mean, we want to be respectful of your time. I know last week, we cut it a little bit short, so we really appreciate you coming, here today and sharing your thoughts. We're really happy to hear that you had that score, some incredible insight. This time, let's do it right. Where can people find you, and we can talk a little bit more about the book, the proper way. So, where can people find you first of all?
The number one place would be on Twitter at Thinking Poker, and the website is thinkingpoker.net. That has mostly at this point, there's links on there to like coaching, which would be thinkingpoker.net/coaching. There's the podcast is kind of the main thing that's centered on there. We're coming up on episode 400, just published number 396. So we've been doing this for over 10 years now. There is on that main page, thinkingpoker.net, there's a couple of, you scroll down a little bit, there's a couple of episodes that are highlighted that I think of as kind of the best ones that we've done. So if you've never listened to the show and you want to get a taste of it, just putting on a random one is not going to give you as good of a sense as if you look on there some of the best episodes of all time. Those are the ones where if you listen to that and you don't like it, maybe the show's just not for you. The show can be very different week to week. So I would encourage people, if they've never listened before, go to thinkingpoker.net and find those like, best episodes of all time and pick one of those that strikes you, and you use that to evaluate the show. And then the books, the main books that I would recommend to people are Play Optimal Poker and Play Optimal Poker 2. Those are kind of the ones where I did a lot of original work and put a lot of effort into trying to explain what I think are potentially complicated or often misunderstood game theory concepts, trying to explain those in a way that's accessible and that explains their relevance. I think this is becoming less of an issue than it was. The first one of those books was published in 2019. So in the last few years, I think people are starting to accept a little bit more why game theory is relevant everywhere. But I think the argument is still out there a little bit of, I play with bad poker players, or I play small stakes, or I play live, and this game theory stuff isn't relevant to me. And the way that I would address that is like, I think essentially game theory is useful in any situation where you're not sure what the right play is. like, this kind of comes back to the intuition thing we were talking about before, right? Where if you're in a spot and you're like, look, I just know this guy is going to call, like he's obviously not folding. So why am I going to bluff here just to be balanced? No, I'm not suggesting that either. Like, I think if you're sure he's going to call, don't bluff. That's fine. We're in agreement. But I think there's a lot of spots where you get to the river and you're like, I'm pretty sure what this person has. Like, I think they have top pair. I have no idea whether or not they're going to call with it. That's where game theory is useful, because like, I don't know if he's going to fold, so I don't want to try it. I don't want to risk it. I'll just check. Like, that's not the right solution. Like that's as bad as just blindly bluffing. So, if you're a poker player who is never in situations where you don't know what to do, congratulations, you don't need game theory. But I certainly often find myself, and even when I'm playing with weak players, I often find myself in situations where I'm not entirely sure what the right play is, or I'm not sure what my opponent's next action is going to be. And so I do find game theory is a useful way of grounding myself, and those books are designed to give you some of the tools to do that.
Excellent. No, that's very well said. And again, the website is thinkingpoker.net, and then you can click on all of these nice links there, the blog, the podcast, all the cool stuff, the books. And the book is books, actually, Play Optimal Poker 1 and 2. And like Andrew said, it's just a way, it's an extra tool in your arsenal, whether or not, you're a field player or a math-based player. It's an extra tool in your arsenal when, you're sort of like in a situation where you might be a little bit lost, or in a situation where it might be simplified on the river or things like that. So there's very useful information in there. And again, this comes from somebody who's, studied, actually, professionally studied, or I guess you can call it, I'm technically licensed in game theory. I've studied at a university level, but and I'm always sometimes skeptical in the way people are using it, but I want to just make that clear that Andrew is very well aware of that, and he takes that into account, and you can hear that when he's describing the book, the idea that he's not discounting the reads, like a read trumps any strategy. If you do have the read, go ahead with your read, but he's talking way beyond that, the extra tool in the toolwork in situations where that read is either not applicable or not available. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Very well said. Thank you.
No, absolutely. So Peter, do you have anything else for our esteemed guest today, or where can people
just want to say thanks very much for lending us your time again, Andrew. You've been a fantastic guest as always. So yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you.
Thank you both. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely. And congratulations again. I mean, we can't stress that enough.
Yes,
congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Excellent. So thank you everybody for tuning in, and we will see you all next Friday.